Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining tonight's webinar hosted by Student Energy at UC Davis. My name is Jean G. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Energy Graduate Group and one of the executive members of this organization. I am joined tonight by my colleagues, Jake Heileman and Anish Sinha, who are also part of the executive team. For those of you who are not familiar with Student Energy, we are a graduate student organization founded in September 2019. The mission of Student Energy at UC Davis is to build a community of energy leaders, share cross-disciplinary knowledge about the energy system, and take action to accelerate the transition to a resilient, decarbonized, and equitable energy future. If you're interested in learning more about our organization, please feel free to check out our website, studentenergydavis.org. This quarter, we have been hosting an exciting series of decarbonization webinars, which has been educational and inspiring to see students and community members from different backgrounds learning about topics which we are very interested in talking about. Tonight, we're focusing on climate policies and politics, which are crucial to accomplishing climate action. I am very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Matto Mildenberger. Before I dive into our introduction and introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. The format for tonight's discussion will be moderated discussion. Questions are welcome. Please send them directly to me, and I will either interweave these questions during the discussion or at the end for a question and answer session. Please keep yourself on mute while our speaker is talking. The webinar will be recorded and posted on Student Energy website and our YouTube channel. Lastly, we'll also have another exciting webinar on climate politics and economics next Tuesday with Dr. Leah Stokes and Dr. Fran Moore. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Matto Mildenberger, an assistant professor of political science at University of California, Santa Barbara. His research explores the political drivers of policy action in the face of serious social and economic threats posed by global climate change. Dr. Mildenberger uses comparative political economy and political behavior, and his work focuses on comparative climate policy making and the dynamics of US climate opinion. His current book compares the politics of carbon pricing across advanced economies with a focus on the history of climate reforms in Australia, Norway, and the United States. Other ongoing work explores public environmental behaviors, political ideology, and the relationship between economic and environmental policy preferences. I will now turn to Dr. Mildenberger to tell us a little bit more about how did you become interested in climate politics and what inspired you to write the book Carbon Captured.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the introduction and thanks for having me. And I'm really happy to be here and happy to have a conversation this evening. I guess the story of how I came to study climate politics is a sort of complicated one. So I actually did my undergraduate degree in sort of a mixture of botany and international relations. So I was all over the place. Did actually a lot of work on mycorrhizal fungi and sort of lichens, and there was a world in which I decided to go back to school at some point and do my PhD on sort of soil carbon cycles. I didn't. I ended up eventually going back to do my PhD after spending some time after college outside of academia, spending some time sort of doing non-academic work after college. And I decided in the end to go back into academia to sort of work more on the social science side of things. And I had a real sense that there are a lot of people doing really amazing work on sort of both the sort of biology, ecology, and also sort of biogeochemistry of climate change. And it felt like there wasn't enough work being done on the political side of things, even though, you know, the political barriers to climate reforms are just sort of a really serious roadblock in any effort to protect the planet. And, you know, I think in some ways there's been a lot of really great work done thinking about, from say the engineering perspective on the technologies necessary to sort of address our climate crisis. And there's quite a bit of good work in economics on the, the financial considerations and incentives that exist to deploy those technologies. And I just think that still, even today, the political side of things has not received the attention that it deserves. And I think that the responsibility for that is both on sort of political scientists who have been historically quite reticent to study climate change and environmental issues for reasons that still puzzle me, though I can speculate a bit about it. And I also think that there has been, there's been certainly an appreciation that we need to understand the politics of this issue to overcome and manage the climate crisis. But often we say things like, we need more political will to address the climate crisis. And sort of the real problem here is that we don't have adequate political will to make change. And I think that that's a very hollow explanation. I think that it's a little bit like, I guess, the ether that many physicists assumed to exist in sort of the 1800s as a way of like explaining, how light was sort of moving in a vacuum. And so they just postulated the existence of this thing that sort of made their theories and understandings of the world work. And I think that too often we sort of treat the political barriers to climate policy action like that. We talk about political will or sort of political appetite, political support. But it's clearly an important variable, and yet it doesn't, the way we talk about it doesn't really give us insight into what's actually going on. And so, in the book that I've just published, Carbon Captured, one of the things I want to do is try and unpack those political conditions that are associated with climate policymaking. And I think it's sort of an indictment of political science that a number of books like this haven't already been written, right? We've had climate policies that have existed in countries around the world for decades now. We've had carbon prices since the early 1990s in some countries around the world. And we don't really yet understand or have good theories to explain, why did some countries act and how did they act, right? So how do we explain these differences in the timing and content of climate reforms? And, my book, which has sort of been part of a long-term research project that I've been working on, is really trying to focus on that, what I think is a really basic question in making sense of sort of the politics of climate change. And it's one that political scientists haven't given enough attention to. And so, just really trying to understand what are the dynamics of political conflict around environmental issues and climate specifically, who are the different actors involved, what are the interests that those actors have, and how do the institutions that exist within different countries structure the debates that, different groups have over climate change.
Yeah, following up on the topics you brought up in your book, specifically giving some more context to our participants tonight. From a couple sentences from your book here, climate policy variations across countries can be best understood by observing how major economic and political actors align themselves during climate policy debates and how that alignment interacts with domestic political institutions. Sort of what you alluded to earlier about, we observe climate policies happening and they're very different across different countries and political institutions. But what's really interesting to me from reading your book is that you talked about how the interests of workers and businesses in carbon-dependent economic sectors do not fall along the usual ideological and partisan lines, but rather climate change divides nations in new ways which we haven't seen before, and that actually reinforces policy inactions. So I'm very curious to kind of hear your explanations and thoughts about how the interests of businesses and workers play out in gaining political power to either support or block certain climate policies.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the big findings and arguments that I advance in the book. First, I think that to make sense of when and how countries act on climate change, we really need to understand sort of the dynamics of the political conflict that happen, right? We need to understand who mobilizes to contest climate reforms, who mobilizes to support climate reforms, and when do those individuals have power, when do they get marginalized, and sort of how does that entire sort of political battle and contestation play out. And as I sort of argue in the book, there's sort of a fundamental feature of climate policy conflict across the world in almost any advanced economy that you look at that I don't think has been appreciated sufficiently when we try and think about how to manage the politics of climate change. And this is something that I call the double representation of carbon polluters. And Jean sort of summarized it fairly well. But here's the basic idea. When we have climate change emerge as an issue on the political agenda, it emerges, let's say, in the late 1980s in many countries. I mean, there was attention to climate change in sort of the US executive branch back into the 60s and 70s, but it really becomes a salient object of political conflict in the late 80s. And that's when a lot of actors, first come to terms with the nature of the climate threat. And so the important thing to understand, right, is that in some ways, like, climate science is exposing this threat. And that process of revealing the threat is happening exogenously. It's happening outside of the political system. Right? And so you have all of these political coalitions that had emerged and developed over decades. And suddenly you have climate change becoming this new issue on the political agenda. And one of the features of climate change as an issue is that it creates divisions within otherwise sort of economic and political allies, right? So it creates divisions, for instance, in the labor movement, because you have some labor groups whose jobs are in sort of low carbon sectors or whose jobs would be threatened by climate impacts. But you also have other workers whose skills and whose livelihoods are highly dependent on carbon intensive oil and gas extraction, or on all sorts of associated economic industries that depend on these core carbon intensive practices. And you also have businesses with the same sort of divisions, right? We have businesses in high carbon industries and businesses in low carbon industries. And so if we just think about like the material interest, the self-interest of different labor and business actors, we can actually see that climate change as a policy threat splits people, splits workers, and splits capital. And as a result, it also splits people on the left who are sort of aligned with labor and are representing the interests of those labor communities in the political system. And, is of course splitting political interests on the right based on the alignment between some of those different right-leaning political groups and capital. And so wherever we look in all the different parts of the world, right, we see this pattern again and again, where we see opponents and proponents of climate action on both the left and the right. Right? And one of the things that means is that no matter whether there's a left-leaning government in power or a right-leaning government in power, the interests of carbon polluters often sort of gets expressed or represented in the sort of political and policymaking debate in that country, right? And so in political science, we think a lot about something called status quo bias in public policymaking, right? The basic idea here is that it's often really hard to change policy. Right? So we have a policy in the books, we have some sort of status quo, and think about the US system, right? We have a status quo set of laws, statutes, and to write a new law, you're going to simultaneously need to sort of control the House of Representatives. You're going to need to have a court system that's not going to overturn the law. You're going to have the president sign the law. And you're, at this point in time, going to need a filibuster-proof supermajority in the Senate, right? So that's, and so you have all of these different, what we call veto points, and you have to control every single veto point so that the reform can happen. If you oppose the policy, you just have to control one. Right? It's enough to control the White House or the Senate or the judiciary or the House. And so it's just to say is that it's a lot more organizationally demanding to pass a reform than it is to block a reform. And so there's this inherent, what we call a status quo bias, where the political systems in many countries are always going to be biased towards staying the same, because it takes more energy and effort and political control and power to change things. And so this double representation of carbon polluters is essentially compounding that political bias, right? That double representation of carbon polluters is making it even more difficult to change reforms, because no matter who's in government, no matter who controls the White House or who controls Congress, there's going to be enough opponents inside the left or the right to sort of block that sort of reform. And it means that climate change as an issue doesn't really fall neatly onto some of sort of the ideological scales, sort of the left-right ideological scale that we often use to try and interpret politics and even environmental politics. I'll give you an example of this from Norway. The very first country in which a democratically elected government lost their government, they would sort of like fell out of government as a result of climate change, was in Norway. Happened all the way back in 1999. So in 1999, the incumbent government in Norway was essentially kicked out of office through a vote of no confidence in the Norwegian parliament. And that government was attempting to block new gas-fired power plants from being built in Norway without there being CCS, carbon capture and sequestration technology. Okay, so in fact, Norway has an extremely clean electricity system. It's like 99% hydropowered. And so the incumbent, gas interests were pushing to build new gas-fired power plants, which would have effectively carbonized the electricity system in the country at the time. And the government at the time was trying to stop these new gas plants from being built in the absence of CCS. Now, the incumbent government at the time was a minority government that was a center-right government led by the Christian Democratic Party of Norway, so essentially centrist. At least in sort of US political terms, they'd be a very like centrist party. And they were sort of kicked out of office through a vote of no confidence that was led by both the Conservative Party in Norway, aligned with Norwegian business, including oil businesses and gas businesses, and the Labour Party in Norway, aligned with workers who would have benefited from these new gas-fired power plants and the sort of emergence of a more robust gas industry. So you had a centrist party attempting to make an ambitious climate policy reform that was sort of ousted from office through sort of labor and capital in alignment with both the left and the right, right? And so there's actually a number of examples like this we can point to around the world where we can't use sort of these left-right heuristics to make sense of what's happening. And it also means that I'm not optimistic that, for instance, a wave of left-wing political victories around the world would necessarily generate political will or manage and create the incentives for climate progress. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And we need to sort of think about how different political actors have different incentives, and then how those actors are distributed across sort of the political landscape in particular countries.
Thank you for the explanation of the double representation and the example you gave about Norway, which is very, very interesting. In my head, I'm just picturing this centrist government getting ousted by very strong labor and business union. Could you comment a little bit more on what that coalition looked like in that example? And more importantly, I'm trying to understand how we may overcome some of these powerful double representation to pass climate legislation.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And I think that there's two somewhat complicated streams of thought that we need to follow, okay? So the first one has to do with thinking about double representation in the United States, okay? Because the United States is in many cases stands as a bit of an exception today relative to a number of other countries. So the first thing so let's talk about that. And then the next thing I want to say is that you asked the question, like, how do we overcome this double representation? And the answer is going to be, it depends. And it's going to depend on like what the institutions in your country are like. So in other words, if you're a country in Europe with sort of a set of institutions that are very distinctive of European policymaking, the right strategy for overcoming double representation should respond to those institutions in Europe. Whereas if you're in the United States, the way that you overcome barriers to climate reforms is going to be a bit different because it has to respond to sort of the political institutions that exist here in the United States. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but we can understand sort of the logic of the conflict, and that's going to help us understand what solution we should choose in, say, the US versus Europe. But let me talk about the US first. So the first thing to know, of course, and all of us know this, is that the US is hyper-polarized at this moment in time, and that includes on the issue of climate change. And in fact, if you're looking at a country around the world that isn't really characterized by this double representation, you might actually look at the current sort of US political system, where it really seems like all of the Republican political elites are very sort of like strongly anti-climate reform right now. And there's enormous support, as you've seen during the Democratic primary, for fairly ambitious action amongst Democratic elites. So I think there's two things that we need to sort of keep in mind here. So one is that there is a lot more variation in public opinion than there is than you'd expect just listening to what's going on in DC. So I do a lot of work, for instance, mapping at the local scale, for instance, political beliefs about climate change amongst Republican voters, right? And in those efforts, in those models, we see that even in very rural conservative parts of the US, it could be that 25, 30% of the Republican base still cares about climate change and wants to see action. So there is sort of this latent pool of potential Republican pro-climate voters. I wrote a paper in the fall looking at sort of taking a representative sample of households with solar installations on their roofs, and then use the voter file to sort of learn more about the partisan affiliation and the voting habits of people who have solar panels on the roof. And if we really sort of compare people with solar panels to otherwise similar neighbors who live around them, we actually see there's quite a bit of balance between, say, Democrats and Republicans. So adopting clean energy, at least at the scale in which it's currently been undertaken, doesn't have this very clear sort of partisan footprint. Okay, so there is this partisan polarization. The two caveats are, one is that it's not as deep as you'd think, just listening to what's happening in DC. And the other thing to remember is that it's really recent. Right? It's actually, even going back 10 years, 15 years, and certainly going all the way back to the early 90s, yes, there was always a bit of a left-right gradient in pro-environmental orientation, going back at least to the sort of Reagan years. But there was a very, very large vocal minority in the Republican Party that was actively working to push climate reforms. And conversely, there was a very loud vocal minority in the Democratic Party that was attempting to block climate reforms, right? So allies of workers in sort of Ohio and West Virginia, like the Joe Manchins of the party, there were many, many more of them 10 years ago. And similarly, there were lots of Republicans who were trying to take leadership roles in on this issue really through sort of the mid-2000s. And so what you've had in the United States is a real sorting in the last 10 years, where what was more like double representation has become more and more, let's call it like a single representation, where you have pro-climate voices sorting into the Democratic Party more homogeneously, and anti-climate voices sorting into the Republican Party more homogeneously. And when we think about why that's happening, there's a bunch of things we can point to, but it really has a lot to do with the political institutions that exist here in the United States, okay, with a very adversarial form of policymaking that we have in the United States. And that means that businesses have an incentive to really mobilize aggressively to undermine incentives to reform policies. And one of the strategies they use is to really create political conflict in the public domain, right? And that sort of then creates incentives for Republicans to sort of take these more strenuous anti-climate positions. The other thing is that in many other countries around the world, the left is sort of anchored in a formal labor party, right? A party who grew out of the labor movement and whose primary sort of objective is to represent the interests of workers in politics. And often these labor parties, there's a sort of formal processes through which labor unions themselves get to shape and dictate what the policy platform of these parties is going to be. That's not the case in the United States. The United States is one of the few countries in the world where its left party is not a labor party. Now, of course, Democrats are aligned with labor interests, but that's almost a sort of an accident of some politics that happened during the Green New Deal. And FDR at the time was very effective during the New Deal era in advancing reforms that sort of undermined efforts to set up a labor party here in the United States. And so it means that industrial unions in the United States do not have the same sort of guaranteed seat at the table in the Democratic Party than they do, for instance, in Australia. Right? Look at coal miners. Coal miners in Australia are about as economically unimportant to sort of overall GDP as they are here in the United States. But the coal miners in Australia have this historical legacy of being part of this labor party. And that means that they have this very strong internal voice, and they can sort of block policies that threaten coal workers. By contrast, the Obama administration was perfectly willing, through the Clean Power Plan and sort of, its Mercury, the math rule, to impose costs on coal, even as, for instance, like the United Mine Workers here in the United States were like engaged in civil disobedience against EPA. And the Obama administration just didn't care. So in other words, we end up in the United States with a very sorted system. And the result is that the right way to, or I don't want to say the right way, I tend to think that a stick-based approach to climate reforms is going to be a better approach, right? The likely way in which climate reforms can sort of overcome these political barriers, according to sort of the theory in my book in the United States, is sort of that costs can be just imposed on polluters. Okay? That's not the case in a place like Norway or Germany, where double representation is still very strong, and it's stabilized and sort of formalized through both the party system as well as the style of policy making that exists. So in Europe, we have a much more consensual, collaborative style of policy making, what political scientists describe as corporatism. And that means that it's very hard to exclude the mine workers or coal companies from the sort of corridors of power. And so a more effective strategy then is often to subsidize the alternative rather than impose costs on the incumbent, right? So subsidizing clean energy is probably going to be a better approach in, say, Germany, while regulating costs on fossil fuels may be a more effective approach, in very high level terms, here in the United States. And so this, I guess, points to the fact that to think about what levers we can use to really drive change, it's not just enough to think about this double representation and sort of who the interests are. We need to think about how the rules of the game, the institutions in each of these countries sort of changes the arena in which this conflict is playing out. And then we need to choose the policy strategies that are going to help us win the battle in the particular arena that we're fighting in.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, to me, it's extremely illuminating to hear this unique case of double representation in the US actually playing out to be more like a single representation, as you described, through this process of sorting in terms of people's political interests and how they align themselves with the parties that will bring about more climate actions or block climate actions. And I think one question that I've been thinking about since I've taken an undergraduate level climate policy class is this dichotomy in the US between state level and federal level policy making, and tying it with the concept of sorting and single representation is that you see some states like New York and California leading in climate policy while other states are not. So where do you see us going in the context of US with this like state level and federal level policy making, as well as the single representation, which you talked about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that it's important that we not get too enamored with this idea that sort of state level policies and city level policies um, can do what needs to happen. So yes, it's great that California is moving ahead. It's great that New York is moving ahead, and these are all wins for the climate. But Texas is not going to suddenly decide to pass laws that are going to sort of put Texan oil and gas out of business. And so, there is a real risk that the cleaner states get even cleaner without sort of bringing the sort of more carbon intensive states along. And that's why sort of a federal system can be really helpful. Because in some ways, like the federal government can impose common standards on all states. And so, if you think about a place like Canada and Alberta, or a place like the United States here with, say, Texas or Louisiana, how will there be costs effectively imposed on carbon polluters in those areas? It's very unlikely to happen through state level policymaking, right? But it's possible that there is a national coalition, right, that probably is not going to have any Texan senators in it, but there's going to be a sufficient national coalition that can form to impose these costs. Now, I do not think there's ever going to be, or in the short term, there's going to be a supermajority in the US Senate for most climate reforms. That's because sort of the structure of the US Senate provides additional representation and sort of gives particular voice to rural parts of the US by having sort of 2 senators for every state. And that also means that some of the rural areas that happen to also be the sites of a lot of fossil fuels sort of have a larger fraction of the votes in the Senate than they would in the House. And that's been quite stable through time. If you look at the number of votes like seriously opposed to climate reforms today in the Senate, it's actually quite similar to how it was in, say, the mid-2000s. It's just that in the mid-2000s, there were a lot of Democrats who were representing Arkansas, Louisiana, these states, and they lost their seats to Republicans who also opposed climate reforms. And then you had some Republicans who, were representing sort of coal interests in, say, Virginia, who lost their seats to Democrats who now are in favor of climate reforms, right? So the sort of political geography of the Senate has stayed quite stable, even as sort of the parties have sorted a bit. It's one of the reasons I think that getting rid of the filibuster is essentially a necessary institutional reform in this country at this point in time. And certainly there are people who are apprehensive about the ease with which it then allows subsequent sort of, say, Republican Senates and Republican presidents to repeal various types of existing policies, right? So it reduces the status quo bias. But I think that's a bargain and a price that the climate movement needs to support, because I don't really see there being a legislative package of the scale necessary to manage the climate crisis without getting rid of the filibuster. And then I think it's possible. I think that there are 51 votes in the Senate, and certainly a majority of the House, and a president who's willing to sign a bill to actually, impose costs on carbon pollution in Texas in a way that you would never get by having to focus on, persuading the state house and governor of Texas to sort of take that action.
Thank you for that. Let's pivot the direction a little bit and entertain some scenarios which have come into from the questions. So one is about labor and climate conversation in the Green New Deal era. One thing that framers of the Green New Deal intend on emphasizing is worker-led transition to a low-carbon economy, one which creates well-paying, unionized green jobs while ensuring compensations for workers of high carbon sectors. In practice, new unions have been split in their embrace of this Green New Deal rhetoric. How do you frame the dynamic between various labor groups and the new wave of climate justice advocates?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And I guess I'll just say that I'm very bullish on sort of the political logic behind proposals like the Green New Deal, right? So I just wrote a book about carbon pricing. I think carbon pricing is a dead end and a terrible idea. It's very efficient and clever from sort of the perspective of its economics, but from a political sort of perspective, it's a really terrible idea, right? So think about what a carbon price is doing. It's saying we need to solve this big, difficult, challenging problem. We're going to take all of the political debate and focus it on a single object, the price, which is a cost, and it's actually a very salient cost that consumers are going to pay in their energy bills, at the pump, in all of these like very high-profile ways. And you better believe that like opponents in fossil fuel companies are going to be very effective at highlighting and making those costs extremely salient. By contrast, the benefits of acting, like not having a sort of catastrophically destabilized climate in 10 years, are sort of backgrounded. So we're foregrounding costs and backgrounding benefits. And that's sort of a recipe for political disaster if what we want to do is sort of pass a carbon price that's like high enough to drive the type of technological change we need at the speed that we need to take. I think there's certainly a role for carbon pricing. It's a very good tool to make marginal adjustments in sort of economic activity. Maybe if we started a carbon price and incrementally ratcheted it up beginning in the early 2000s, it would be a different story now. But I just don't know that you can find a political coalition to support a carbon price that's foregrounding costs and backgrounding benefits at the scale necessary to sort of manage the climate crisis, given what science tells us we need to do over, say, the next 15 years. So the thing that I think is really effective about proposals like the Green New Deal is that they're sort of premised on a different political logic, right? They're premised on a political logic that's trying to foreground benefits. And the costs are still there, but they're more indirect. They're less salient. If people have to pay a tax at the gas pump, that's highly salient. If they end up the government ends up spending and going slightly more into debt because of some government expenditures, right? That's a much more indirect cost and one that's much harder to sort of politicize. And in fact, I published a paper recently and did some work using what we call conjoint experiments. But the basic idea here is we give people these random combinations of different policies, right? And then ask them to choose between two different policy packages. So policy A is going to have, for instance, just climate policies. And policy B is going to add, say, support for worker training and a bunch of other Green New Deal-like elements. And what we find is that integrating economic policy making and climate policy making, right? So the logic of the Green New Deal that sort of including these compensation investment platforms in our climate reform packages, that turns out to make climate reforms more popular. So when we integrate these economic considerations and worker considerations into our climate reform descriptions, people are much, much more likely to support the climate policy than they otherwise would, right? So this makes people more likely to support climate reforms. I actually just came out of the field on a different survey that sort of reflects sort of the coronavirus, where we ask the opposite question. So not like, does including economic considerations make climate policy more popular? Does including climate-related and energy-related reform planks in a COVID response package make COVID response more popular? And we find again that it does, right? So green investments, green stimulus spending, turns out to increase the popularity of aggressive government response to the COVID crisis. So we have these twin crises, right? And the economic crisis is being sort of we're seeing that play out right now with the COVID crisis, but we could also think about income inequality and a range of different sort of economic injustices which exist today in the United States. And integrating climate into the solutions for those makes economic policy more popular. And integrating economic considerations into climate reforms makes those more popular. And so to me, that says that this compensation-based approach, the sort of spirit of the Green New Deal, is actually a very effective way forward. Now, I don't think realistically that there will be sort of a Green New Deal package in Congress that's going to have government healthcare and a variety of like really robust social spending planks. But I do think that we're very likely to have a climate package. The next climate package is going to be very oriented around sort of this worker-led, compensation-led, investment-led sort of approach to climate reforms. I think it's going to be easier to build a winning political coalition here using that approach than it has been in the past with a very sort of cost-forward, carbon pricing-based approach. Now, I should say, like, economists will say that this sort of Green New Deal style approach is less efficient, and they're right? Theoretically speaking, there's probably, the marginal cost of abating a certain ton of carbon is going to be a little higher. But I think we actually overemphasize the importance of efficiency as a criteria to evaluate different climate policy proposals. And I think that there are trade-offs through time that we need to factor into our analysis. So imagine that we want to implement our ideal policy from sort of an efficiency and economics perspective in 2025, or let's say 2030. There is an argument to be made that you actually want to have highly inefficient policies in the short term that will re-scramble the political system and change the distribution of political power today, that's going to then unlock the ability to pass a more efficient policy in, say, 2030. In other words, you need to, you have these entrenched incumbent fossil fuel companies who are very active in distorting policymaking and blocking certain types of reforms. And you need to destroy their political power before there is political space to pass a sort of more idealistic or idealized carbon pricing style climate reform. Now, if we're trying to think between today and 2040, it's actually possible that like over that entire time period, the most efficient approach is to be inefficient in the short term, to disrupt political power, to allow the conditions to exist for a more efficient policy between 2030 and 2040. And so I just think that we don't think enough about sort of the political dimension of some of these policy instruments. And if we don't factor that political logic into our evaluation of different instruments, then we may not be actually optimizing correctly to sort of have the cheapest policy approach in the long term to drive change within the constraints that exist inside our political system.
Yes, I think it's really great to hear your framing of the Green New Deal as being a policy of a different political logic where we're foregrounding the benefits and backgrounding the costs. And I'm very glad that you brought up the economic considerations of it, because the economist side of me is just screaming in my head, like, what do we think about the economic inefficiency for a policy, the style of the Green New Deal? But I do agree that we are supposed to think more broadly about how we can build some of these political support. And perhaps the road to get there is to have some economic inefficiency, tolerate that, and then building that political support for something like the Green New Deal, which definitely operates on a different political logic than, say, the carbon pricing. So it's really interesting to hear that perspective. I want to delve a little more into the California case and thinking about this transition in California from the abundant use of natural gas to a lot of electrification of home appliances, and a lot of the natural gas workers facing that transition as an existential threat. So thinking about equity and just transition, how does your research inform your perspective on what this transition may look like in California?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's a way that we can manage the climate crisis without thinking about issues of equity. Right? I think we have to think about, and I'm encouraged that those that considerations of equity are increasingly part of the policymaking dialogue, though I do think there's still sort of a ways to go. You know, if we have a system where there is some form of double representation, where there's both workers and capital who have sort of a stake in sort of the status quo economy, then in some ways, like a just transition and consideration of both equity, both in terms of sort of racial environmental injustice as well as sort of socioeconomic environmental injustices, you know, we need to somehow cleave workers away from sort of their coalition with the capital in their areas, right? And that involves thinking about where there are sort of an absence of alternative economic opportunities, right? Like, you know, most people don't actually have that much control over the carbon intensity of their lives, right? I'm very critical of sort of perspectives on, for instance, climate reform that emphasize personal choice, personal sacrifice, you know, flight shaming or sort of driving shaming or any of these things, right? Like it's just not, most of us are locked into an economic system where we don't have much choice other than to consume fossil fuels. And the solution is not individual behavior change. The solution is policy change at sort of the state and national level, right? Like, I mean, think about like even just sort of basic inequities in the Bay Area, right? You know, there's housing is extremely expensive. There's a massive housing shortage. And so people with sort of less socioeconomic prosperity are forced to live much farther away from where the jobs are and end up commuting a lot more, and maybe don't even have transit alternatives, right? So like there's just not this, there's not sort of equal access to our ability to engage in sort of a low carbon lifestyle, right? It's still very, you know, and so that needs to be front and center, that any solution to the climate crisis needs to ensure that the benefits of the new economy are not just trickling down to people with certain structural advantages, right? So that's sort of one thing that we need to think about. The other thing is that, you know, I think that there's increasingly conversations about stranded costs and stranded assets in sort of the fossil fuel sector, right? And so, you know, we talk about sort of, you know, peak natural gas plants that might be stranded or coal plants that are stranded, and increasingly, I think a number of companies have managed to really push forward sort of policymaking agendas to compensate them for those stranded assets. But we have to remember that like the skills that people have and their livelihoods and their employment and their jobs are also going to be stranded, right, by sort of a decarbonization at the scale. Really carefully about ways in which we can push forward an energy transition that's equitable and accommodates sort of their, you know, that you know, allows maybe sort of older fossil fuel workers to retire with dignity, and provides younger fossil fuel workers a real career outside of the fossil fuel industry, right? It's not just enough to sort of, you know, you see this in the politics of trade, right? We've had like, you know, 20, 30 years of trade adjustment policies where we sort of compensate workers who are dislocated as a result of sort of free trade agreements. And those policies have been deeply unpopular and not terribly successful, such that, you know, many people living in fossil fuel intensive parts of the country, which also happen to be very trade impacted parts of the country, are very skeptical that, you know, that there's really any type of viable compensation to make up for sort of this government intervention to wrest away their livelihoods. And so it's really important that that there be sort of long-term, systematic, sort of unrestrained investment in ensuring that, you know, these stranded skills and all of sort of the culture and community that comes with those is not sort of left behind. And that's also going to have the benefit of breaking the double representation of carbon polluters by sort of bringing labor unions into sort of a benefits compensation-based coalition and sort of consolidating the left in a way that will allow the left in the United States to be willing to just impose costs on, for instance, coal and even eventually gas, the way that's going to be necessary.
Yeah, thank you for your insights on that. I also find it interesting to think about that, in this very particular context of stranded assets of natural gas and the workers that are in this industry, but using this as a microcosm for what the concepts that you talked about in your book and applying that to the specific political context of the US, what that could look like, what that transition could look like. Just for my curiosity, would you say that like a Green New Deal style policy where we were foregrounding benefits and backgrounding costs would be more aligned with trying to accomplish equity in this context?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. And so for going back to, for instance, the study that I just published in Environmental Research Letters, where we were exploring how linking these different policy domains shape public support. So first of all, just to say is that at least on economic justice considerations, integrating economic justice considerations from sort of something as simple as a $15 minimum wage to sort of more sophisticated programs, it has the effect of growing support for climate reforms amongst both Republicans and Democrats in our sample, right? So it's not that like it's really bringing Democrats along and sort of we're seeing this effect where it's sort of putting Republicans off. On the economic justice considerations, we see sort of a bipartisan pull towards supporting reforms in the presence of these policies. That's not true for all social policy. So like if you integrate government healthcare into a climate reform bill, not that anyone would ever do that, but let's imagine hypothetically you tried to, it would increase net support for the climate reform bill, but that's because it would massively increase Democratic support, but it would actually drive Republicans away a little bit. And on net, it would still increase the pie, but not enough. So we have this evidence that it's sort of bipartisan. But the other important finding from our paper is that this integration of justice and equity concerns into climate policymaking, which is sort of part of the underlying logic of the Green New Deal, it also is particularly effective at increasing support amongst people of color in the United States for climate reforms. And so when we sort of look at how different sort of racial and ethnic subgroups are responding to this particular experiment, we actually see that this twinning of concerns about economic inequality and economic opportunity with climate change sort of expands the pie and really draws new people into the climate reform coalition. And I think that, so all to say is that I think that, intuitively, this compensation and equity-based political logic is of course going to serve these needs and help correct some of the really serious economic and racial injustices that exist. But then, we have at least a little bit in my lab of empirical evidence to sort of, to support that logic and sort of emphasize that, at least in this moment in time, that is actually how the public is receiving these proposals and how it's playing out.
Thank you very much. I know we're near the 8 o'clock mark, and I definitely have more questions for Matto, but I also want to open up the floor to the audience for any questions you may want to pose. Just feel free to send them to me in the chat. And in the meantime, we can talk about what more questions we have and kind of judge from the audience participation.
Sure.
So this is sort of related to your earlier comment on having 51 votes in the Senate, and the majority in the House. So let's assume a Biden presidency, which would potentially bring us that. What differences in the political landscape surrounding climate legislation do you expect in Biden administration compared to Obama? Do you think the relative power of high carbon capital and high carbon labor has decreased since 2009?
Not in general, but yes, in the Democratic Party. Right, so I said earlier that like in the United States, there's a higher political willingness to impose costs on carbon polluters. There's also a higher, but it oscillates. You also then have the Trump administration where carbon polluters are essentially running the show. So you're sort of moving back and forth in a way that you don't in Europe, where sort of everything is much more sort of moderate and constrained, where everyone is sort of at the table most of the time. So, my read of Biden is that he is extremely likely to appoint people into decision-making positions on the climate file that are going to be extremely committed to aggressive, rapid, all hands-on-deck climate policy responses. And so I do think that a Biden administration will look very differently than an Obama administration. In fact, even if some of the same personnel are staffing the administration, I think that the thinking and logic and sort of beliefs about what's necessary amongst that sort of climate advocacy crowd has shifted. And so, I expect that the bare minimum we'd expect in a Biden administration is going to be a substantially more aggressive set of climate proposals. I think the fact that climate change is such a high priority for Democratic voters, and the fact that climate change received so much actually really structured and important attention during the primary campaign has really sort of put it on the agenda in a really serious way. And I actually think that because the Biden administration will be focused on amending Obamacare rather than trying to implement a sort of de facto new health reform, sort of a Medicare for all style solution, that's going to create probably more space in the first 6 to 9 months of the administration to focus on a big climate reform package, rather than healthcare, again, getting most of the attention as it did in 2009. So I'd be very surprised if there isn't sort of serious effort to legislate some clean energy transition, labor and compensation-based investment strategies in very early 2021 if the Democrats take back the Senate and Biden wins the presidency. And then I expected that the executive branch is going to be substantially more aggressive in trying to use any regulatory or executive branch power that it can to take fairly serious action. Things like just outright prohibiting sort of drilling on federal lands, efforts to sort of control sort of fossil fuel imports and exports. I think that the Trump administration wasted about 2 years having its first wave of cabinet appointees in places like Interior and EPA, did an enormous amount of harm, but did it very incompetently, right? So if you think about like someone like Ryan Zinke in Interior, if you think like Scott Pruitt at EPA, they were quite bumbling, and they did a very bad job of trying to repeal and replace and manage the regulatory process. And so most of the retrenchment that was undertaken in the first year or two of the Trump administration, I think, is going to fail, or a large part of it will fail in court. And I think that, under Wheeler and Barnhart, there's been much more effective and devastating sort of attacks against environmental and climate related regulations in the last sort of 16 to 20 months. But I think that it's going to be much easier to sort of reverse and try and manage some of that sort of destructive regulation if Biden wins the presidency, because not enough time will have passed to really lock some of that in. And a lot of regulations are going to sort of be works in progress. And I think we're going to see regulations being rescinded the same way the Republicans did in early 2017. So, the net effect of the Trump administration is going to be pretty devastating in terms of policymaking capacity and in terms of sort of fossil fuel development. But it's going to be substantially less devastating than it would have been if there'd been a more competent set of cabinet appointees in place for the first year or two, who, people like Pruitt, they were more interested in sort of symbolic short-term action rather than sort of doing the paperwork and the regulatory process necessary to ensure that the decisions they were making were going to stand up. And so, if you were sort of a die-hard fossil fuel lobbyist, you wasted about 16 months that you could have locked in a lot more damage than I think they'll be able to lock in, provided that the Democrats do take back the presidency in the fall.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. It's definitely an exciting time to be thinking about these questions and looking forward to see what happens in November. We have some questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. So one of the questions was talking about how you mentioned very early on in this introduction where political science as a field discipline hadn't really been interested in environmental and climate questions. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to overstate it. There's sort of, there have been a number of political scientists who've been very focused on understanding sort of the international component of climate change. So, you know, there's a subfield of political science we call international relations. And, you know, scholars in that space have done a lot of work thinking about COPs, thinking about climate negotiations, you know, analyzing climate agreements and, you know, trying to think about what the logic of negotiating a global climate agreement is like. And there's also been, you know, a lot of American scholars who've done a lot of good thinking on environmental policy in the US through time. But I think two things are true. One, that there's been much less thinking about sort of national level policymaking and comparative policymaking between different countries. So we've got a lot of local scale work, a lot of international work, and sort of this in between has been neglected a bit. And the other thing is that, you know, for a long time, and it's only changing in the last several years, you know, I think many political scientists have just not seen the environment as a very interesting variable. And not that they don't think it's an important variable, they just don't think it's a variable that politics has a lot of impact on. So if you look at, for instance, environmental degradation, right? They say, yes, environmental degradation is really interesting, but the root causes of, you know, there's a big debate in the 90s about the link between environmental degradation and violence, right? And it's a very controversial topic in political science because a number of people said, yes, we want to understand violence, but environmental degradation is not really an important explanation for violence. And that's because, yes, sometimes it might be the case we have, for instance, a civil war or environmental degradation in the presence of, we have a civil war in the presence of environmental degradation. But it's not really like, where does the environmental degradation come from, right? That environmental degradation comes from socioeconomic dislocation. It comes from, so, you know, in social science, we call this epiphenomenal. So the idea is that to the degree that the environment matters, it's just sort of a mediator variable. It's actually just one chain and a link. And if you follow that link another step back, you get sort of an economic or, you know, social or political explanation. And so that discouraged, I think, several generations of scholars from really giving the environment the attention that it deserved. I also think it's sort of been a very difficult topic to study because, you know, it tends to be quite difficult to reconstruct sort of how policymaking happens in sort of, you know, state or national levels. But I think in the last 5 or 10 years, that's finally changed. And so there's a lot of scholars now in political science making up for lost time. But certainly if you look at, you know, tax policy, immigration policy, social welfare policy, environmental policy, sort of all of those other domains sort of have been studied by political scientists for longer than sort of environment and climate issues. And it's only recently that sort of there's been a catching up and a recognition that these topics got neglected.
Thank you for that. And on the topic of climate policies and in your research came in about, economists would typically agree that there is this saliency of carbon tax and would argue that carbon tax, however, could be returned on a per capita basis so that large majorities of people could be better off. So how do you see that dialogue being played out in the political landscape? And can you talk about why the tax and dividend idea doesn't seem to gain much traction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, one solution to the problem of carbon taxation being salient is recognizing, okay, we're foregrounding costs and backgrounding benefits. So we had better create a new benefit. And that will do that by earmarking or returning through sort of, say, a rating neutral income tax adjustment. All of those carbon tax revenues, or a large part of the carbon tax revenues, back to the public. And so suddenly you're not just talking about the tax, but you're talking about this benefit. So there's a check in the mail or some sort of financial benefit that's coming. Now, I want to make 2 points. The first, a theoretical one, the second, an empirical one. Okay, theoretically, I just want to note that the benefit that then is sort of part of the political debate is still not the real benefit, right? The real benefit is having a stable climate in 10 years and not having the enormous, severe economic and social dislocation that climate change is going to create. So we're creating a different benefit that helps us politically, but it's still not sort of fully bringing to the foreground like the real benefit, right? And so you see people say things like, well, why would I pay a tax to get the tax back? Why not just not pay the tax in the first place? But still, it's an interesting idea, and it's one that we need to sort of empirically examine. So there are 2 countries in the world that have some form of a carbon tax and dividend policy. Okay, one is Switzerland, which has had a sort of a carbon tax and dividend for a number of years now, and the other is Canada, which started a sort of a carbon tax and dividend policy in some provinces beginning on April 1st of last year. And so, my lab has done work in both of those settings to sort of investigate and study sort of on the ground how these dividends have been received. And unfortunately, sort of that research comes to fairly pessimistic conclusions on sort of empirical grounds. So in both countries, so for instance, in Canada, I've run sort of a 5-wave panel survey starting last year, where we sort of followed the same group of Canadians before the policy started, after the policy started, after they got their first dividend check, after an election in which the sort of policy was sort of a major object of conflict, and then again during this COVID crisis. So we've been trying to understand, how is the political logic working? Is actually sort of the receipt of these benefits, is that actually sort of generating increased public support amongst Canadians for this policy? And there the answer is sort of dispiriting, and the answer is largely no. So not only, so we're just not seeing a movement of Canadians to be more supportive of carbon taxation as a function of receiving these individual financial benefits. Now, there's a number of reasons why we might be getting the absence of an effect, right? And one of the biggest ones is that in both Switzerland and Canada, these cap and dividend policies, or in this case, tax and dividend policies, were implemented very poorly. In other words, if you want to provide the public with a financial benefit, you want to make that benefit extremely salient. In Switzerland, the benefit is given indirectly through this sort of health rebate bill. And in Canada, it's just folded into people's income tax returns. So the government is not really making transparent the nature of this benefit. So maybe the dividend is not working as theoretically expected because it's been implemented in a really bad way. And so one thing that we then did is we ran an experiment on people in our sample. And because we had collected all sorts of information from them in previous waves of the survey, we were able to know exactly how much money they had personally received as a dividend. And we prepared essentially mock tax forms individually for every single respondent in our survey that revealed to those respondents like exactly what they had been receiving as benefits associated with this carbon tax policy. And then we randomly assigned some people in our survey to receive this information and other people not, right? And that still didn't have an effect. That still didn't drive support. In fact, there was a backlash we found where people who discovered they'd received sort of $600 in sort of a carbon tax rebate were more likely to believe that they weren't being made whole. In other words, people have this intuitive sense that their costs are much higher than the level of their rebate. And even revealing to people the true level of their rebate, it actually sort of created a backlash. It made people feel like they weren't being reimbursed the amount of money they believe they were paying in costs, right? And in fact, it's also the case that most people substantially underestimate the amount of their rebate, right? So they believe they're getting hundreds of dollars less than they actually are in practice. Now, in the Canadian case, it's a highly progressive rebate program. About 80% of households make more money in a given year from the rebate than they pay in the tax, right? And yet those households, even though they were each net beneficiaries, were actually sort of largely believing that they were becoming bigger losers the more information they got about their individual rebate. So this is sort of a meandering answer, but just some cautionary notes that both theoretically and also in all of this empirical work I've done on this topic, I'm not finding a lot of evidence that these dividend policies are working politically the way that advocates are hoping. And so I'm not at all persuaded that they sort of unlock the politics of carbon pricing. And in fact, I think that all of the negative politics of carbon pricing remain even in the presence of a dividend, and it's much better to move into a more benefits investment compensation-based world, and invest in new political actors and industries and ways of disrupting political power before we move into sort of a focus on sort of marginal low-cost abatement. Let me say a related thing. It's also the case, sort of carbon pricing, emissions trading, carbon taxation, there's this assumption that it doesn't really matter where you reduce a ton of carbon pollution, right? A ton of carbon pollution you reduce in one country, in one economic sector, in one part of the world is the same as one you produce somewhere else. And that's because each ton of carbon pollution contributes the exact same amount to the global climate crisis. That's true. And so therefore, we should always be looking for the cheapest, easiest place to reduce carbon pollution globally. I'm not so sure about that, right? Because I think that even though 1 ton of carbon pollution is the same from a sort of biogeophysical perspective, how society chooses to allow carbon pollution to proceed is sort of an implicit effort to legitimize and allow certain economic actors to continue releasing carbon pollution and others not to, right? So it may be the case that it's much cheaper to reduce carbon pollution in Brazil than it is in the US today. But I don't think that means that we should focus all of our efforts in Brazil, because in order to sort of pass the policies we're going to need in 2030, the distribution of political power here in the United States has to change, right? And so sometimes higher marginal cost abatement can have secondary effects on the distribution of political power that allows for cheaper, better abatement opportunities in the future. And so I just think that we need to recognize that, we're making decisions about political power when we choose who to impose costs on. And our decisions need to factor in sort of our long-term theory of political change rather than just sort of our short-term sense of what's economically efficient. The same is true, the emissions trading, is very controversial and quite criticized within, for instance, EJ communities, right? And that's because, yes, it is the case that a ton of carbon pollution reduced in one part of the state is the same as a ton of carbon pollution reduced in another part of the state. But by allowing certain plants to sort of not have to pay for their, or not have to close, or giving certain sort of industries an opportunity to manage their carbon pollution on balance, I guess, carbon pollution accounting without changing their operations, means that certain types of co-pollutants and particulates, right, are continuing to be released by those plants. And so emissions trading for carbon, right, can legitimize or entrench the presence of certain sort of polluting point source pollution sources or point source pollutants in certain parts of the state. And we know that those point source pollution, factories and power plants are disproportionately located in sort of communities of color and disproportionated in sort of communities with socioeconomic disadvantages, right? There's a really great PNS paper that I'm sure some of you have seen from a few years ago that sort of looks at the relationship of where our goods and manufacturing and energy is produced in this country and where it's consumed, right? And so 2/3 of the pollution associated with sort of the consumption of the wealthiest white Americans are essentially being borne by poorer and people of color in the US, right? So essentially, the literal lives of many people in this country are subsidizing sort of the lives of other people, right? And so, these sorts of fundamental racial and environmental injustices need to be factored into our thinking about how to design these policy instruments as well, right? And it's just a reminder that we shouldn't use sort of simple economic metrics in an uncritical way as if they represent the full scope of considerations and values that need to be accommodated in a policy design process. And in fact, there's all sorts of equity and politics linked considerations that may be as important. And when we factor those explicitly into our analysis and bring them into our decision-making tools, we may end up supporting a different policy instrument. And we may not get there if we continue to sort of hold efficiency in a very narrow economic sense as somehow being the primary objective, when there may be actually a much wider range of policymaking objectives that we need to focus on to effectively decarbonize, over the time scale that needs to happen. Because the choices we make about how to decarbonize are also choices about what the politics is going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. And climate policymaking is not a one-shot game. We're going to need to be at this now for the next 20 years, year after year, ratcheting up the ambition every year, introducing new reforms every year. And we need to make sure that the political and policy decisions we make today start the ball rolling down the hill rather than leading to a false start. And that means we need to really think about the political logic of our actions, not just the economic logic.
Thank you very much for your response. I find it extremely interesting to hear about how, in your role as a political scientist, the experiments which you've conducted and the empirical evidence you find, which are oftentimes, in this case, in the Canadian carbon tax case, surprising to what we would expect. So as a wrap-up question to conclude tonight's discussion, as a political scientist and professor, how do you envision your work having an influence on climate policy at large? And by doing what, producing research and conducting experiments to demonstrate the importance of understanding not just the political feasibility of it, but incorporating economics and social science as part of that, how do you see the direction of your work go in the future?
Yeah, look, I'm a very eclectic researcher. And I use a range of methods from sort of fairly advanced statistical work to qualitative work and interview-based work, right? The book that I talked about earlier today is entirely based on interviews with senior policymaking elites in different countries. And I just think that there are so many things we don't know about the politics of climate change and that would be useful to know, right? Doing a lot of work right now on direct experience. So we, I think there's been a hope challenges of climate change is that there's an intertemporal trade-off in its political logic. We need governments today to take action that are imposing short-term costs, but are only sort of associated with these longer-term benefits, right? So the ideal policy that we might have today is going to be unrelated, sort of engages in aggressive, ambitious policy today. The benefits of that may only be experienced 10, 15 years down the road when they're no longer in office, right? And so there's been a lot of hope that as climate change begins to sort of materialize, that sort of trade-off will change. So do people who think they've experienced climate change, do they become more sort of likely to be sort of pro-climate actors, right? So I have a paper that's coming out soon where we explore this in the California context. So we were interested in, does experiencing a wildfire in California change your willingness to vote for pro-climate ballot initiatives? So like AB 32 or some of these energy ballot initiatives that were passed or contested in the sort of the late 2000s. And so we create a panel and do some very careful analysis. And what we find is that, yes, experiencing a wildfire does increase pro-climate voting at sort of the electoral precinct level in California, but largely amongst Democrats. So in other words, people who already believe climate change is happening, they filter their experiences through the lens of climate change. It makes them more likely and more willing to act. But if we look at more Republican parts of the state, they're entirely unresponsive to wildfires. So there's no sort of treatment effect, no signal that brings you from the experience of a wildfire to sort of a more pro-environmental outcome. And I see the same thing in a bunch of other work that we've done. I did some work around the planned power safety shutoffs in the fall, where we were sort of sampling people living on either side of the PSPS boundaries and sort of lots of different parts of Northern California, right? And we really see that people do not, who do not already understand this as an issue, are not adapting to the experience of climate change in a way that is pushing forward action. And so that means we need a lot more storytelling about the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day lives. And, you know, I see my work as both doing some sort of very objective, hard-nosed empirical analysis, and also, you know, a lot of the work I do in public opinion and downscaling of climate and energy opinions is also about supporting that narrative and supporting environmental advocates who are pushing that narrative, so that sort of our political officials have a more accurate understanding about what their constituents want on this issue.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's
been
a really great discussion. It's definitely been very educational for me to hear you talk more about your books and explain some of the concepts with the examples that are relevant to our political context in the US, and as well as hearing about your empirical work and what you're thinking as an academic and political scientist. It seems like our audience is also very interested in learning more about resources on this topic. So if you'd like to share those with us, you could email us and then we can distribute it to our listserv.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I think you guys are talking with Leah next week, and her new book on sort of state level energy transitions is something that I definitely recommend. Work by Barry Rabe at the University of Michigan is pretty good on this. There's a good book by Michael Eklund and Johannes Erpelainen on sort of renewable energy. And yeah, those are actually probably some pretty good starting points for some of the sort of political considerations here. But if I think of anything else, I'll let you know as well.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's a lot of fun.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Matto.
Okay. Take care.